The winter of 1886 didn't just bring snow. It brought a silence so deep and a cold so sharp it could snap a man's hope like a dry twig. They called it the Great Die-Up, a season where the mercury plunged to 60 below and the cattle froze, where they stood, statues of ice against the barbed wire. But for one woman, a city-bred beauty named Elara, this white hell was not a history lesson, it was a grave. Abandoned by a stagecoach driver who panicked when the sky turned black, she was left alone in the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Montana Territory. She had walked for hours, her silk dress offering no more protection than a spiderweb against the biting gale. She was ready to lie down, ready to let the snow cover her, when she saw it, a flicker of orange light in the distance. A cabin. But the man inside, a scarred and solitary rancher named Silas, had sworn never to let another soul into his life. What happens when a man who wants to be alone is forced to save a woman who has nowhere else to go? You are about to witness a Christmas story of survival, redemption, and a love that burned hot enough to melt the cruelest winter in American history. Before we step into the storm, I need you to do something for me. If you believe that the stories of the Old West deserve to be told, hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube that you want more tales of grit and romance. Make sure you are subscribed to Frontier Rescue Stories and have that notification bell turned on so you never miss a rescue. And I want to know, where in the world are you watching this story from? Drop your country or state in the comments below. I read every single one. Now wrap your blanket tight. The blizzard is here. Silas Thorne stood on the porch of his cabin, the rough-hewn logs creaking under the assault of the wind. He narrowed his eyes, squinting against the stinging ice crystals that felt like buckshot against his weathered skin. He was a waddy of the old breed, a man who had spent more time in the saddle than on his own 2 feet. But even he had never seen a winter like this. The thermometer nailed to the support beam read 40 below zero, a temperature that turned breath into ice before it could leave your lips. The sky was a bruising shade of purple and gray, the hallmark of a storm that intended to kill anything foolish, enough to be caught above snakes. He adjusted his Stetson, pulling it low, and wrapped his buffalo hide coat tighter around his frame. He had been checking the perimeter, ensuring the drift fences hadn't collapsed under the weight of the snow. The cattle were already huddled in the lee of the ravine, their breath steaming in the frigid air. Silas was about to turn back, to retreat into the solitude he had cultivated for 5 long years, when a flash of color caught his eye. It was an unnatural blue, a shade of cobalt that didn't exist in nature, certainly not in the monochrome world of a Montana winter. "What in the blazes?" Silas muttered, the wind tearing the words from his mouth. He watched as the blue shape moved. It wasn't a deer and it wasn't a wolf. It was stumbling, falling, and rising again with an agonizing slowness. It was a person, a woman. Silas felt a curse rise in his throat. He didn't want company. He didn't want complications. He wanted the silence of the snow. But the code of the frontier was etched into his bones deeper than any desire for isolation. You didn't leave a human being to the mercy of the Great Die-Up. Silas grabbed his Winchester from where it leaned against the door frame. Checking the action out of habit, he snatched a coil of hemp rope and tied it to his belt. The snow was waist-deep in the drifts, and if he went down, he'd need a way to pull himself out. He stepped off the porch, his snowshoes crunching loudly on the hard-packed crust. Every step was a battle against the wind, which pushed against him like a physical hand. As he drew closer, the figure collapsed face first into the powder. Silas picked up his pace, his lungs burning with the cold air. When he reached her, he rolled her over. She was terrifyingly pale, her lips a dangerous shade of violet. She was dressed in a Polonaise-style coat, fashionable for a stroll in a city park, but laughably inadequate for the high plains. Her hat was gone, her hair matted with ice. "Wake up!" Silas roared over the gale, slapping her cheek lightly with his gloved hand. "Don't you dare die on my land!" She didn't stir. Silas knew he had minutes before the frostbite took her fingers and toes. If it hadn't already, he scooped her up, surprised by how light she felt in his arms, fragile as a bird. He turned back toward the cabin, the orange glow of the window, the only beacon in a world rapidly turning white. He trudged forward, his legs burning, carrying the unwanted burden of a life he was now responsible for saving. The interior of the cabin was a stark contrast to the white hell outside. The air was thick with the scent of pine resin and wood smoke, warmed by a pot-bellied stove that glowed cherry red in the dim light. Silas kicked the heavy oak door shut, dropping the crossbar into place with a decisive thud that sealed out the howling wind. He carried the unconscious woman to the bear hide rug in front of the hearth, laying her down with a surprising gentleness for a man with calloused hands. He knelt beside her, his mind racing through the catalog of frontier medicine he had picked up over the years. First, the cold clothes had to go. Wet wool and silk would only suck the heat right back out of her. He worked quickly, unbuttoning her coat. The fabric was stiff, frozen into awkward shapes. Beneath the coat, she wore a dress of fine silk, a garment that spoke of wealth and city living, a rational dress that had no place in a log cabin. "Forgive me, ma'am," Silas muttered to the unconscious form. "Necessity ain't got no manners." He stripped the outer layers, wrapping her immediately in his spare wool blankets, rough, scratchy army-issue blankets that smelled of tobacco and sage but were warm. He grabbed a bottle of coffin varnish, his cheapest whiskey, from the shelf and poured a little onto a rag. He wasn't going to make her drink it yet. Choking was a risk. Instead, he rubbed the alcohol briskly onto her hands and feet. The friction generating heat, the alcohol stimulating the blood flow. Her toes were waxy, white as marble. Frostbite was knocking at the door but hadn't entered yet. He went to the stove, where a kettle was perpetually steaming. He poured hot water into a basin, mixing in a handful of dried mustard powder he kept for poultices. The sharp, tangy smell filled the small room. He soaked rags in the mixture and placed them carefully around her extremities, avoiding direct heat which could cause tissue damage. Silas sat back on his heels, wiping sweat from his forehead. He watched her chest. It rose and fell in shallow, ragged hitches. He looked around his cabin, the walls lined with newsprint for insulation, the single bunk, the rifle rack. It was a fortress of solitude, and now it had been breached. A low groan from the floor snapped his attention back. The woman's eyelids fluttered. They opened, revealing eyes the color of spring moss, wide and terrified. She scrambled backward, clutching the blanket to her chin, her gaze darting around the shadowy room before landing on the bearded giant looming over her. Her voice was a dry croak. "Am I dead?" "Not unless hell froze over, ma'am," Silas grunted, standing up to tower over her. "Though you were halfway through the gates. You're in my cabin, named Silas." She shivered, her teeth chattering. "The driver." The wheel broke. He said he saw lights. "He ran." "Driver's likely dead," Silas said bluntly. He didn't believe in sugarcoating the frontier. "And you're lucky you aren't joining him. What kind of addlepot travels the pass in December?" I had to," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm Elara Vance. Please, sir." "I'm so cold." Silas sighed, the harshness in his face softening just a fraction. He poured a tin cup of coffee, black as pitch and hot enough to strip paint. "Drink this, Miss Vance. It'll put some fire in your belly. We're snowed in. Could be days, so you best get comfortable." The storm raged for 3 days without pause, a relentless assault that buried the cabin up to the windowsills. Inside, the world had shrunk to the 12 by 12 space of the main room. A fragile truce had formed between Silas and Elara. She sat by the fire, wrapped in his oversized flannel shirts, while he paced the floorboards like a caged cougar. Silas was a man of few words, and Elara was a woman of too many questions. She asked about the California-style pants he wore, about the strange tools on the wall, about the silence that seemed to hang over him like a shroud. "You got a lot of wind for someone who nearly froze to death," Silas grumbled on the third evening, stirring a pot of beans that had been simmering for hours. "And you have very little for someone who saved my life," Elara retorted, her spirit returning with her strength. "I'm just trying to distract myself from the hunger." "Silas, my stomach thinks my throat's been cut." Silas paused, the spoon hovering over the pot. He looked at the shelves. The great die-up hadn't just killed cattle. It had cut off supply lines. The store in town hadn't seen a wagon in a month. His larder was terrifyingly empty. A sack of flour, a side of salt pork, some dried beans, and a jar of molasses. "We got a ration," Silas said, his voice low. "I didn't stock up for 2. And this storm—" "The almanac says it's going to be a long one." "I can cook," Elara offered. I can make do. My grandmother taught me how to make a vinegar pie when there were no lemons. An eggless cake when the hens stopped laying." Silas raised an eyebrow. "Vinegar pie? Sounds like something you'd feed a prisoner." "It's sweet," she insisted, a small smile touching her lips. "You use vinegar, sugar, water, and cornstarch. It tastes like lemon custard. If you have the sugar. I got sugar, Silas admitted. But we save it. For now it's beans and coffee. He dished out 2 bowls. He gave her the fuller one. Elara noticed. She tried to push it back. You're a big man, Silas. You need the strength to chop wood. I just sit here. Eat it, he commanded. You need fat on your bones to keep the cold out. I'm tough as old wang leather. They ate in silence, the wind whistling down the chimney. To break the quiet, Elara began to talk about her life. Back east, about oyster cocktails and green, pepper shells and roast goose with potato stuffing, foods that sounded like fairy tales in the dim cabin. Silas listened despite himself. He found himself picturing her in a bright dining room, laughing, far away from the wolves and the ice. Why did you come here, Elara? He asked suddenly. To the edge of the world? She set her spoon down. The light died in her eyes. I came for a wedding. My fiancé, he wrote to me, said he struck gold, said he built a mansion. And, Silas prompted, and when I got to the town, I found out the only gold he struck was the label on a whiskey bottle. He was a blatherskite, Silas, a liar. There was no mansion, just a rented room above a saloon and a debt he wanted my dowry to pay. Silas nodded grimly. It was a common story. So you ran. I ran, she confirmed. Right into a blizzard. Well, Silas said, standing to clear the plates, you traded a snake for a wolf. But at least the wolf is honest about trying to kill you. The 4th night brought a terror that made the hunger seem trivial. Silas was asleep in his bunk, one hand resting on the stock of his Winchester, when a sound pierced the howling wind. It was the high-pitched, terrified scream of a horse. Buster, Silas hissed, bolting upright. Elara woke with a gasp from her place on the rug. What is it? Wolves, Silas said, his voice tight with adrenaline. They smell the horse. They're desperate. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed the lantern and his rifle. Bar the door behind me, Elara. Do not open it unless you hear my voice. You can't go out there, she cried, scrambling up. It's pitch black. My horse is out there, Silas roared. Buster wasn't just livestock. He was the only living thing Silas had cared about for 5 years. He kicked the door open, and the storm rushed in. Extinguishing the lantern instantly, Silas stepped into the maelstrom. The snow was blinding, but he could hear the snarling, the tearing of wood. The pack had dug under the lean-to attached to the cabin. He raised the rifle, firing a shot into the air to scatter them. Crack! The sound was swallowed by the wind. The flash illuminated the scene. 5 gaunt timber wolves, ribs showing through their matted fur. They weren't running. They were starving, and starvation makes a coward brave. One of them, a massive gray male, turned from the horse and lunged at Silas. Silas swung the rifle butt, catching the wolf in the jaw. But the ice under his boots betrayed him. He slipped, going down hard. The wolf was on him in a heartbeat, snapping at his throat. Silas threw up his arm, the thick buffalo hide coat taking the brunt of the bite. But the pressure was crushing. He grappled with the beast, his hand searching for his belt knife. But his fingers were numb. Suddenly the cabin door flew open. Elara stood there silhouetted by the firelight. She held a burning piece of firewood in her hand, the pitch pine flaming like a torch. Get away from him! She screamed, a primal sound that cut through the storm. She hurled the burning wood. It tumbled through the air and struck the wolf's flank, showering sparks. The beast yelped, the fire terrifying it more than the gun. It released Silas and scrambled back. Silas, move! Elara yelled. Silas didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled backward, crab-walking through the snow until he reached the porch. He grabbed Elara by the waist and pulled her inside, slamming the door and dropping the bar just as a heavy body thudded against the wood from the outside. They collapsed on the floor, panting, their breath mingling in white clouds. Silas clutched his arm. The coat was shredded, blood seeping through the layers, but the bone held. He looked at Elara. She was shaking. Soot smeared on her face, her hands burned from the wood. You opened the door, Silas wheezed, staring at her. I told you to stay put. I'm not good at following orders, she gasped, a wild look in her eyes. And I wasn't going to let you die. Who would cook the beans? Silas started to laugh. It was a rusty, painful sound, but it was real. You're a crazy woman, Elara Vance, a pure addlepot. And you're welcome, she said, clutching her burned hand. The wolf attack changed everything. The cabin was no longer a shelter. It was a fortress under siege. The wolves didn't leave. They circled the cabin day and night, their howls a constant reminder of the death waiting outside. Silas moved the horse, Buster, into the main room of the cabin, partitioning off a corner with stacked firewood. The smell of the animal was strong, but his body heat helped warm the room. Supplies were critical. They were down to a half cup of beans a day. Silas spent hours at the window, rifle in hand, waiting for a clear shot at a wolf, not for safety, but for meat. Frontier survival wasn't pretty. Wolf meat was tough and stringy, but it was protein. "We need to keep our minds busy," Elara said one afternoon. She was mending Silas's torn coat with a bone needle and thread she had found. "Tell me about the 4 dead in 5 seconds gunfight." "I read about it in the papers back east." Silas looked up from cleaning his gun. "You read dime novels, do you?" "I read everything," she said. "Was it true? Did the marshal really drop 4 men that fast?" "Dallas Staudenmeier," Silas nodded. "El Paso, 81. I was there, passing through. It was messy. Not like the stories. A lot of smoke, a lot of screaming. Bystanders got hit. It wasn't heroic, Elara. It was just loud." He walked over to the mantel and picked up a small object. It was a child's doll, made of corn husks and scraps of calico. He had been avoiding looking at it since Elara arrived. "Who was she?" Elara asked softly. She didn't look up from her sewing. Silas was silent for a long time. "Sarah, my daughter. She took the fever 3 winters ago." "Her mother?" "My Mary. Went a week later. Grief acts faster than typhus sometimes." Elara stopped sewing. "That's why you're up here. You're punishing yourself." "I'm protecting them," Silas said, his voice cracking. "I couldn't protect them when they were alive. So I protect their memory. I don't let the world touch me." "But you let me in," Elara said. "Didn't have much choice," Silas grunted. "But there was no heat in it." "It's almost Christmas," Elara said, changing the subject. "Back home we'd be lighting luminarias, putting candles in paper sacks with sand to light the way for the Christ child." "No paper sacks here," Silas said. "And candles are precious." "We can make do," she said. "We have fat. We have rags. We can make a light, Silas, just for one night." Silas looked at her. She was thin, her cheekbones sharp from hunger, but her eyes were blazing. She was starving, freezing, and trapped. But she was still trying to bring light into the darkness. He felt something shift in his chest, a cracking of the ice that had encased his heart for 3 years. "All right," he said gruffly. "We'll make a light." The days blurred into a white haze. To conserve energy, they spent long hours sitting by the stove, sharing stories that peeled back the layers of their pasts. Silas spoke of the open range before the barbed wire, describing the long drive from Texas to Montana. "A cowboy's life isn't what you think," Silas told her, whittling a piece of pine kindling. "It's mostly dust, bad coffee, and hours staring at a cow's rear end. We slept on the ground, wrapped in a slicker when it rained. We ate son-of-a-gun stew. Don't ask what's in it, and we dreamed of a bath." "And the romance?" Elara teased. "The dashing heroes?" "Mostly myths," Silas chuckled. "Most waddies I knew were just boys running from a plow or a jail cell. But there was a code. You rode for the brand. You didn't complain, and you never, ever left a man behind. That's why you saved me," Elara said. "The code. Maybe," Silas said, looking at her. "Or maybe I just got tired of the quiet." He asked her about Boston. She told him about the Rational Dress Society and how her mother was scandalized that she wanted to wear pants. She told him about the opera, humming a few bars of Verdi. "I wanted to be a singer," she confessed. "But my father said the stage was for harlots. So I was to be a wife. And I failed at that too." "You didn't fail," Silas said firmly. "You survived. That's the only test that matters out here. You got more grit in your little finger than that fiancé of yours had in his whole body. He's a Simon Pure coward." Elara smiled, a genuine flush of color returning to her cheeks. "Thank you, Silas." The moment hung in the air, heavy and sweet. For the first time, they weren't just 2 survivors huddled for warmth. They were a man and a woman, seeing each other clearly across the firelight. But the moment was shattered by a coughing fit. Elara doubled over, her body racking with spasms. When she pulled her hand away from her mouth, Silas saw a speck of blood. The coughing didn't stop. By the morning of December 24th, Elara was burning up. The lung fever, pneumonia, had set in. Her weakened state, combined with the cold and lack of food, made her an easy target. Silas was frantic. He paced the small cabin, checking his meager supplies. He had no medicine. The whiskey was gone. He remembered the old remedies the native women used to trade at the fort. Willow bark for fever. He had some dried bark. He brewed a tea, forcing the bitter liquid down Elara's throat. She was delirious. "The lights," she murmured, her eyes unfocused. "Did we light the luminarias?" "Not yet, Elara," Silas whispered, wiping her forehead with a damp rag. "Tonight. We'll light them tonight." He needed a poultice to draw the infection out. He didn't have mustard or onions. He looked at the jar of turpentine in the corner. It was harsh, dangerous if used wrong, but it was a counter-irritant. He mixed a small amount with the last of the lard. "This is going to burn," he told her gently. He unbuttoned her nightshirt, rubbing the mixture onto her chest. She whimpered but didn't pull away. He covered her with heated wool flannel. "Stay with me," Silas prayed, holding her hand. "You wanted Christmas. You got to stay for Christmas." To distract her and himself, he decided to decorate. He had no popcorn or cranberries to string. He looked around. He took some old tin cans, punching holes in them with a nail to create patterns, stars, crosses. He placed a small wick of twisted rag and a pool of rendered fat inside each can. He set them on the windowsill. "Look, Elara," he whispered. "Luminarias." She opened her eyes, gazing at the flickering patterns of light dancing on the log walls. "Beautiful," she breathed. "Like stars." Night fell, the longest night of the year. The wind outside finally died, leaving a silence that felt ominous. The temperature plummeted even further. Inside, the battle for Elara's life reached its crisis point. Her breathing was shallow, a terrifying rattle in her chest. Silas sat in the chair beside her, watching the rise and fall of her chest. He felt a fear he hadn't felt since the night Mary died. He realized with a jolt of clarity that he loved her. Not just as a responsibility, but as a partner. She had brought life back into his tomb. "Silas." Her voice was barely a ghost of a sound. "I'm here." "If I go." "You aren't going," he growled, squeezing her hand. "If I go," she persisted. "Don't let the wolves get me. Bury me deep." "Hush," Silas commanded, tears stinging his eyes. "You listen to me, Elara Vance. You are a stubborn, city-bred opera-singing nuisance. And you are the best thing that's happened to this mountain in 5 years. You fight. You hear me? You fight." He stood up and went to the corner where his fiddle case lay gathering dust. He hadn't touched it since Sarah's funeral. He opened the case, the smell of rosin and old wood filling the air. He tuned it, the strings groaning. "You wanted music," he said. "I'm going to play until you get better." He began to play, rough at first, then finding the rhythm. He played Silent Night, he played hard. Times Come Again No More. The music filled the cabin, pushing back the shadows. He played for hours, his fingers cramping, his heart pouring into the wood and strings. He played until the sun began to bleed gray light through the frosted window. Silas startled awake. He had fallen asleep in the chair, the fiddle across his lap. The fire had burned down to embers. Panic seized his chest. The room was silent. No rattling breath. "Elara!" He dropped the fiddle and fell to his knees beside her. She lay perfectly still. He reached for her neck, his hand trembling so hard he could barely control it. She took a deep, clear breath and opened her eyes. The fever glaze was gone. Her skin was cool to the touch. She looked at him, blinking. "Why did you stop playing?" she whispered. Silas let out a sob, a sound that was half laugh, half cry. He collapsed forward, resting his forehead against her hand. "Merry Christmas, Elara. Merry Christmas." She smiled weakly, stroking his hair. "I'm hungry, Silas. I could eat a horse." Silas laughed, wiping his eyes. "Well, Buster's right there, but I think we can find something else." He made a pot liquor soup from the last of the salt pork and beans, feeding it to her slowly. She was weak, but the shadow of death had passed. "I have something for you," Silas said, standing up. He went to the mantel and picked up a small object he had been whittling during the long nights. He handed it to her. It was a bird carved from soft pine. It was rough. Silas was no artist, but the wings were spread wide, caught in mid-flight. "A meadowlark," Elara said, running her thumb over the wood. "It signifies hope," Silas said awkwardly. "And freedom. When the snow melts, you can fly away, back to your world." Elara looked at the bird, then at Silas. What if the bird doesn't want to fly away? What if it found a sturdy tree to build a nest in? Silas looked at her, his heart hammering. "It's a hard life up here, Elara. Cold, lonely." "I haven't been lonely since I walked through that door," she said. Their moment was shattered by a distant shout. "Hello, the house!" Silas stood up, the old instinct taking over. He grabbed his rifle and moved to the window. Down in the valley, a dark smudge against the white snow. Horses, a sled. "It's the sheriff," Silas said, his voice flat. "They made it through." Elara sat up, clutching the wooden bird. "They're here?" "To take you back," Silas said. "To town, to the train." "To Boston?" He opened the door. The cold air rushed in, but it didn't feel as biting as before. The rescue party rode up, steam rising from their horses. "Silas," the sheriff called out, his face wrapped in wool. "We found the stage wreckage days ago. Figured everyone was a goner. Saw your smoke this morning. You alive in there?" "We're alive," Silas called back. "I got the survivor here. She's recovering from lung fever." "Well, bring her out." The sheriff cheered. "We got a sled with buffalo robes. We can get her to the dock in town by supper." Silas turned to Elara. "Time to go." Elara stood up. She looked at the cabin, at the bare rug where she had almost died, at the tin can luminarias on the windowsill, at the man who had saved her. "Silas." "Don't," he said, turning away to pack her coat. "Don't make it harder. You belong in a world with sidewalks and opera houses, not here with wolves and beans." She put on her coat. She walked to the door. She stopped and looked back. Silas was standing by the fire, his back to her, rigid as a post. "Goodbye, Silas," she whispered. He didn't turn around. "Goodbye, Elara." The silence that followed her departure was heavier than the storm. Silas sat by the fire, staring into the flames. The cabin felt enormous. It felt empty. He looked at the mantel. Sarah's doll was there, but the spot next to it was empty. She had taken the bird. Days turned into weeks. The great die-up finally broke. The Chinook winds came, warm and fast, melting the snow and revealing the devastation. Carcasses of cattle littered the plains, a grim testament to the winter's fury. Silas rode the range, doing the grim work of skinning the dead stock to salvage the hides. It was brutal, bloody work, but it kept his hands busy. But his mind wouldn't rest. He kept hearing her humming. He kept smelling the phantom scent of mustard poultice and lavender water. One evening, Silas rode into town to sell the hides. The town was recovering. He walked into the general store to buy flour. The shopkeeper looked at him. "You hear the news, Silas?" "I don't listen to gossip," Silas grunted. "That woman you saved? Miss Vance, she's still at the hotel. Heard she's singing at the church social tonight. Raising money for the families who lost stock." Silas froze. "She didn't leave?" "Not yet. Waiting for the train, they say. But the tracks are clear now." Silas left the flour on the counter. He walked out, mounting Buster. He didn't go back to the ranch. He rode to the church. The church was glowing with light. Music spilled out of the open doors. Real music. A piano, a fiddle, and a voice. Her voice. Clear, strong, and beautiful. Silas stood at the back of the room, hat in hand. Elara was at the front singing Amazing Grace. She looked healthy. Her cheeks were pink. She was wearing a fine dress again. She looked like she belonged there. She finished the song. The room applauded. She looked up, scanning the crowd. Her eyes stopped at the back of the room. She froze. Silas walked down the aisle. The crowd parted for him, the wild mountain man, the monster of Lost Hope Creek. He didn't look at them. He looked only at her. He stopped in front of the stage. "You missed your train," he said. "I let it go," she said, her voice trembling. "Why?" "Because I forgot something," she said. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the wooden bird. "A bird needs a tree, Silas. You told me that." Silas looked at the bird, then at her. He took a step closer, ignoring the whispers of the town. "I am not got much, Elara. The herd is gone. The cabin is drafty, and I'm a hard man to live with." "I know." She smiled, stepping down from the stage to stand toe-to-toe with him. "But you make a fine cup of coffee, and you play a decent fiddle." Silas smiled, and it was like the sun breaking over the mountains. He took her hand. "Reckon we better get home then. It's planting season." They walked out of the church together into the cool spring air. The winter of death was over. The ice had melted, and on the high plains under the vast canopy of stars, a new life was beginning. What a journey, folks. From the frozen despair of the great die-up to the warmth of a spring wedding. Silas and Elara proved that even when the world freezes over, the human heart can still find a way to burn. If you enjoyed this story of survival and love, please give this video a thumbs up. It really helps us keep these rescue stories coming. And I want to ask you a question. Do you think Elara was crazy for staying? Or was she the smartest woman in the territory? Let me know in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe and check out our other video, The Sheriff Who Refused to Carry a Gun, right there on your screen. Stay safe, keep your powder dry, and we'll see you on the next frontier.